The penthouse was filled with an oppressive, heavy silence, a silence Chunhua used like a blade to keep her underlings in line. This cold quiet is shattered not by a gunshot, but by the wet, rhythmic splatter of wine hitting marble. Much like a predator sensing a wound, Chunhua's Iron Lily persona flares to life at the sight of the stain on her silk. But Hazel's own intuitive sense for house cleaning pulls her toward the mess rather than away from the boss's rage. The hook locks the audience's attention when this invisible maid stands over the most feared woman in Korea, refusing to lower her gaze even as Chunhua's guards reach for their weapons. The story introduces Hazel Jamal, a woman who has spent years living on the fringes of the very world she built, like a ghost that high society refuses to see. With her calm, regal composure and simple uniform, she is often viewed as a disposable tool by the guests she serves, leading to a life of quiet, bone-weary isolation. For years, Hazel has survived by being a shadow, wandering the halls of the global sovereign chain and offering her silent service for scraps of peace. She should have stayed quiet when the insults started flying, but her survival instincts are suddenly overridden by a flare of her truth-seeker sense, a visceral intolerance for cruelty that pulls her into the light. There she faces Chunhua, the Iron Lily, and despite being a nobody with everything to lose, she decides she is tired of watching the powerful trample the weak. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. Chunhua stood tall, her eyes flashing with a cold, predatory fire that usually made senators and rival bosses tremble. She expected the woman at her feet to dissolve into tears, to beg for her life, or at least for her job. But as the seconds ticked by in the silent penthouse, the atmosphere shifted. The woman in the simple gray apron didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly looked up, and in her dark, steady eyes, Chunhua didn't see terror. She saw a profound, unshakable calm. Then Hazel smiled. It wasn't a nervous twitch or a polite customer service mask. It was the serene, knowing smile of a queen, watching a child throw a tantrum in her court. Hazel stood up in a single fluid motion, ignoring the dripping red wine on her apron. She didn't wipe it away. She simply reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out a slim, gold-plated communicator that looked far too expensive for a maid to possess. Pressing a button, her voice rang out, devoid of any subservient tone. "Security, this is the Sovereign. Code black on Penthouse 5. Terminate all access for the Neri party immediately." Chunhua let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "What kind of game is this? You think some radio prank is going to save you from me? I am the Iron Lily of Soul." "And I," Hazel said, her voice dropping to a smooth, velvety register that sent a sudden, unexpected chill down Chunhua's spine, "am the woman who owns the roof over your head, and every other roof in this global chain." Before Chunhua could lash out with another venomous insult, her phone buzzed violently in her hand. Then her lead guard's radio crackled with an automated high-priority alert. At the exact same moment, the electronic locks on the penthouse doors clicked shut with a heavy, magnetic thud, glowing a menacing red. Chunhua frantically looked at her screen. A string of emergency notifications flooded her vision. Accounts frozen, access revoked, assets flagged. In the span of a heartbeat, the digital empire she used to wield her terror had been severed at the root. The realization slammed into her like a physical blow. The black woman she had just insulted held the financial kill switch to her entire operation. Hazel took a step forward, the power dynamic in the room flipping so violently it left the air tasting of ozone. "You come into my home, breathe my air, and insult my people," Hazel whispered, her gaze pinning the Mafia boss in place. "The merger is dead, Chunhua, and as of right now, so is your immunity. Let's see how long the Iron Lily lasts without her thorns." The red glow of the locked door was the last thing Chunhua's loyal guards saw before the service elevator plummeted, leaving them stranded in a corridor that now belonged entirely to the Sovereign. For the first time in her life, the Iron Lily felt the icy breath of true isolation. Her phone was a useless brick of glass in her hand, her bank accounts were severed, and the men who had been paid to bleed for her were locked on the other side of an impenetrable wall. She looked at Hazel, the woman she had called a pathetic maid just minutes ago. Hazel was no longer smiling. She moved with a calculated, silent efficiency, pulling a master keycard from her pocket and sliding it into a hidden panel in the elevator's wall. "Why are you helping me?" Chunhua hissed, her pride still struggling to breathe beneath the crushing weight of her new reality. "Because your rivals are already in my lobby, and I don't like blood on my carpets," Hazel replied calmly, as the elevator doors groaned open. The transition was jarring. The scent of expensive wine and French perfume vanished, replaced by the industrial hum of roaring boilers and the thick, humid scent of detergent. They were in the bowels of the hotel, the basement labyrinth where the invisible machinery of luxury kept the world above spinning. Pipes groaned overhead like caged beasts, and the dim fluorescent lights cast long, skeletal shadows across the concrete floor. Hazel led her to a small, secluded corner behind the massive commercial laundry machines. It was a makeshift break area with a worn plastic table and a single flickering lamp. "Sit," Hazel commanded, her voice brooking no argument. "The Sovereign is a fortress, but even a fortress has cracks. My security team is holding your executioners at bay in the main terminal, but if you step outside these walls, you are a dead woman." Chunhua sank onto the plastic chair, the fine white silk of her ruined suit looking absurd against the gritty backdrop of the basement. She looked at her hands, which were shaking. She had built her entire identity on being untouchable, but in a single hour she had been stripped of her guards, her money, and her crown. She was no longer the Iron Lily. She was just a frightened woman hiding in the dark. Hazel leaned against a steel pillar, crossing her arms as she looked down at the fallen queen. There was no mockery in her eyes, only a quiet, observant depth that made Chunhua's heart race in a completely different way. "You wanted to know if I knew who you were," Hazel said softly, the hum of the machinery vibrating between them. "I do. Now it's time to find out who you are when you have nothing left." The humid heat of the laundry room was a physical weight, but it was nothing compared to the heavy gray fabric Hazel had just dropped into Chunhua's lap. It was a standard-issue Sovereign server uniform, complete with a crisp white apron. "Put it on," Hazel said, her voice smooth and unyielding. Chunhua stared at the polyester as if it were coated in poison. "You cannot be serious. I am a nary. I do not carry trays. I do not bow." "The nary name doesn't pay for the air you're breathing right now," Hazel countered, leaning over the table. Her proximity was suddenly overwhelming, the faint scent of jasmine and expensive soap clashing beautifully with the industrial basement. "In this hotel, everyone earns their keep. You want my protection? You learn what it feels like to be invisible." An hour later, the Iron Lily was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer, agonizing weight of a loaded silver tray. Hazel walked beside her through the service corridors, a silent shadow guiding her to the VIP floor. Chunhua's first assignment was a suite occupied by a notoriously demanding tech mogul, the kind of man Chunhua would have had killed for looking at her the wrong way. "Keep your eyes down, your back straight, and do not speak unless spoken to," Hazel whispered just before the doors opened. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in humiliation. The guest didn't even look at Chunhua's face. He snapped his fingers to demand more water, complained that the ice was melting too fast, and at one point accidentally knocked a heavy glass of water off the table, splashing Chunhua's shoes. He didn't apologize. He simply waved his hand as if dismissing an annoying insect. Chunhua's knuckles turned white on the edge of her tray. A dark, violent urge screamed at her to wrap the silver platter around the man's throat, to remind him who she was. But then she felt a steadying hand on the small of her back. Hazel was there, stepping into the room to smoothly diffuse the situation, her touch warm and grounding against Chunhua's rigid spine. When they finally retreated back into the quiet of the service elevator, Chunhua collapsed against the mirrored wall, breathing heavily. She looked at her reflection, disheveled, stained, and utterly powerless. "He didn't even see me," Chunhua whispered, her voice raw. "I was standing right there, and he didn't exist to him." "Now you know," Hazel said softly, stepping closer until only a breath of space separated them. She reached up, gently wiping a stray bead of sweat from Chunhua's forehead, her fingers lingering just a second too long. "That was you, Chunhua. Every day. Now you decide if that's the kind of monster you still want to be." The scent of rosemary and garlic cut through the sterile kitchen air, turning the massive culinary hub of the Sovereign into a stainless steel cathedral of silence. Midnight had arrived, and with it, a temporary truce. Hazel had bypassed the gourmet menu to prepare a simple, steaming bowl of handmade noodles. comfort food designed to soothe a bruised soul rather than impress a critic. Chunhwa sat on the edge of a steel prep table, her stiff server uniform unbuttoned at the collar. The fierce, untouchable posture of the Iron Lily was gone, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. She stared into the bowl, watching the steam rise, before taking a hesitant bite. It was warm, rich, and tasted fiercely of home. "Why did you become her?" Hazel asked softly. She was leaning against the counter opposite Chunhwa, the dim overhead heat lamps casting a golden glow over her features. "The woman who steps on anyone in her path?" Chunhwa paused, her chopsticks suspended in midair. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. For a long moment, Hazel thought the Mafia boss would snap back with another insult. Instead, Chunhwa's shoulders sagged. "My father was the previous head of the Neri Syndicate," Chunhwa whispered, her voice raw and devoid of her usual sharp edges. "When I was 12, a rival gang broke into our estate. They made me watch as they executed my mother. They said she was too soft, a liability to the family name." She looked down at the dark broth, her knuckles turning white. "My father handed me a gun that same night. He told me that in our world, you are either the predator or the prey. I didn't want to become a monster, Hazel. I just didn't want to die." Hazel didn't offer hollow pity. She knew all too well what it felt like to build a fortress around yourself just to survive the world's cruelty. Slowly, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them until the scent of her jasmine perfume filled Chunhwa's senses. "You aren't that terrified 12-year-old girl anymore," Hazel said, her voice dropping to a velvety grounding register. She reached out, her warm, dark hand covering Chunhwa's trembling one on the cold metal table. "And you don't have to be a weapon to be safe here." Chunhwa froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She looked up, her sharp, dark eyes meeting Hazel's steady, compassionate gaze. The air between them suddenly felt supercharged, vibrating with a pull that had nothing to do with power or money. In the quiet solitude of the midnight kitchen, the first real spark of romance ignited, leaving both women wondering what would happen when their two unstoppable worlds finally collided. The fragile bubble of peace they had created in the midnight kitchen did not survive the rising sun. By morning, the lobby of the Emerald Sovereign was thick with a new, suffocating tension. The automated security systems were still holding the perimeter, but physical walls could only deter a hungry predator for so long. Jinho, Chunhwa's ruthless second-in-command, did not sneak into the hotel. He strode through the revolving glass doors like a storm making landfall, flanked by a dozen heavily armed loyalists. He was the man who had executed her father's darkest orders, a cold tactician who viewed any display of emotion as a terminal illness. To him, Chunhwa's sudden radio silence and her failure to finalize the high-stakes merger weren't a crisis. They were an opportunity. He had seen the grainy security feeds of her in a server's uniform, and it was all the proof he needed. From the hidden surveillance hub in the basement, Hazel and Chunhwa watched the monitors in breathless silence. Chunhwa's heart hammered against her ribs as she saw Jinho approach the main desk, slamming a heavy black tactical knife directly into the polished mahogany counter. "I know the Iron Lily is hiding in here." Jinho's voice boomed through the audio monitors, devoid of any loyalty. "And I know she's traded her bun for a serving tray. She's gone soft, and a soft leader is a dead leader. Bring her to me, or I will burn this palace to the ground." Chunhwa felt the old, cold terror of that 12-year-old girl clawing its way back up her throat. Her knuckles turned white against the edge of the control desk. She instinctively reached for her waistband, forgetting she no longer carried the weight of her signature Beretta. She was defenseless, stripped of her armor, facing the very wolf she had helped raise. But before the panic could swallow her whole, Hazel stepped directly into her line of sight. The billionaire didn't look at the terrifying screens. She looked only at Chunhwa. There was no fear in Hazel's dark eyes, only a fierce, protective fire that seemed to burn away the shadows in the room. Hazel reached out, her warm hand cupping Chunhwa's cheek and gently tilting her face up. The touch was a powerful anchor in the rising storm. "He thinks you are weak because you stopped being a monster," Hazel whispered, her thumb brushing tenderly over Chunhwa's trembling lips. Let him think that. Let him underestimate the woman who was about to take everything from him. Hazel straightened her posture, a subtle shift that transformed her from a quiet protector into the undisputed ruler of a global empire. She tapped a command on the terminal, opening a direct line to the lobby speakers. "This is the Sovereign," Hazel spoke. Her voice dropped to a smooth, ice-cold register that made Jinho freeze in his tracks. "You are trespassing on my property, Jinho. You have exactly 60 seconds to remove your blade from my counter, or I will ensure you never hold a weapon again." The silence that followed Hazel's ultimatum was heavy, thick with the arrogance of men who only understood power when it was shouted or spat from a barrel. In the lobby, Jinho let out a jagged, mocking laugh, his hand still white-knuckled on the hilt of the knife embedded in the Sovereign's mahogany. He didn't see a threat. He saw a hotelier playing at war. "You have 60 seconds, Hazel repeated, her voice a calm, low vibration that seemed to hum through the very floorboards beneath Jinho's boots. She didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, her fingers danced across a holographic terminal with the precision of a concert pianist. Beside her, Chunhwa watched the screens, her breath hitching as a series of complex data streams began to cascade in a digital waterfall. She had spent a decade ruling through fear, thinking that blood was the only currency that mattered. But as she watched Hazel work, she realized she had been playing a child's game. "What are you doing?" Chunhwa whispered, her eyes wide. "I'm performing a surgical strike," Hazel replied, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering blue light of the monitors. "Your world is built on logistics, Chunhwa. Shipping lanes, shell companies, offshore accounts. You think you're a ghost in the system, but the system is mine." On the lobby monitors, Jinho's confident sneer began to falter. His pocket buzzed once, then twice, then became a frantic staccato vibration. He pulled out his phone, his face draining of color as he scrolled through a nightmare. One by one, the Neri Syndicate's lifeblood was being cauterized. Their cargo ships in the port of Busan were being seized by customs for clerical errors. Their laundering fronts in Macau were being shuttered by sudden aggressive audits. The untraceable accounts that funded his mutiny were simply gone. "This is impossible," Jinho roared, his voice cracking with the first notes of genuine panic. He looked up at the security cameras, no longer a predator, but a trapped animal. "How are you doing this?" "I don't need a gun to kill your ambition, Jinho," Hazel spoke into the intercom, her tone almost conversational. "I am the Sovereign. I am the bank, the landlord, and the infrastructure. You are a tenant who has overstayed his welcome." Chunhwa felt a strange, electric shiver run down her spine. She looked at Hazel, the woman who had knelt at her feet in a stained apron, and saw a power so absolute it made her own Mafia empire look like a house of cards. This was soft power, wielded with a surgeon's grace and a queen's authority. Hazel turned away from the console, the digital war already won, and stepped back into Chunhwa's space. The intensity in her gaze shifted from cold calculation to a fierce, protective warmth. She reached out, her fingers dangling gently with Chunhwa's, grounding her in the sudden, quiet aftermath of the strike. "The wolves are starving now," Hazel whispered, her thumb brushing over Chunhwa's knuckles. "They can't hurt you if they can't afford the bullets." In the dim light of the surveillance hub, Chunhwa realized that the invisible Maid had just dismantled a decade of terror with a few keystrokes. She didn't feel small in the shadow of Hazel's power. For the first time in her life, she felt safe. The grand ballroom of the Emerald Sovereign was a galaxy of crystal chandeliers and whispered scandals, but the atmosphere curdled into a sudden, shocked silence as the private elevator doors slid open. For years, the owner of the Sovereign Empire had been a ghost, a name on a ledger that no one could pin to a face. Tonight, the ghost had taken flesh. Hazel stepped into the light, her transformation absolute. Gone was the gray linen apron and the quiet humility of the service corridors. She wore a gown of midnight velvet that seemed to absorb the room's glare, her dark skin glowing against a collar of raw, unpolished diamonds. Beside her, clutching her arm with a fierce, newfound grace, was Chunhwa. The Iron Lily had traded her blood-stained white silk for a structured suit of shimmering emerald, her sharp features softened by a look of defiant vulnerability. The high society of Seoul, the same people who had whispered racial slurs behind Hazel's back and trembled at Chanhwa's name, stood frozen with their champagne flutes halfway to their lips. They saw a maid, who was actually their landlord, and a monster who was now protected by the world's most powerful bank. "They're staring," Chanhwa whispered, her voice a low vibration that only Hazel could hear. Her hand tightened on Hazel's silk-clad arm, the old instinct to reach for a weapon flickering in her eyes. "Let them," Hazel replied, her voice a smooth, unshakable anchor. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at Chanhwa, her gaze filled with a warmth that made the opulence of the room feel cold by comparison. "They spent their lives looking down on us because they thought we were small. Tonight, we show them how tall we've always been." As they moved through the crowd, the power dynamic of the city rearranged itself in their wake. Men who had tried to buy the sovereign now scrambled to bow, and women who had ignored Hazel in the hallways suddenly found themselves unable to meet her steady, regal gaze. But Hazel ignored the fawning. She led Chanhwa to the center of the floor, the music swelling into a slow, haunting waltz. In the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by the elite who had shunned them both, the two women began to dance. It wasn't just a performance of power. It was an act of reclamation. Hazel's hand rested firmly on the small of Chanhwa's back, pulling her close until their hearts beat in a synchronized, defiant rhythm. For the first time in her life, Chanhwa didn't feel like a predator or a prey. She felt seen. "You're shaking," Hazel murmured, her breath warm against Chanhwa's ear as they spun beneath the crystal lights. "I've never been this visible before," Chanhwa admitted, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of fear and wonder. "Get used to it," Hazel whispered, her thumb brushing tenderly over Chanhwa's knuckles. "The world belongs to the ones who survive the dark together." But as the final notes of the waltz faded, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall creaked open. A shadow moved against the gold-leafed walls, a reminder that while they had conquered high society, the wolves of the underworld were still waiting for their pound of flesh. The crystal silence of the ballroom shattered with the sudden, jagged crack of a gunshot. The sound tore through the music and the polite laughter like a serrated blade, and for a heartbeat, time became a viscous golden syrup. Jin-ho stood in the shadows of the arched doorway, his face a twisted mask of desperation and ruin, his arm leveled with the mechanical precision of a man who had nothing left to lose but his soul. Hazel was the target, the invisible queen who had dismantled his empire with a few keystrokes was the one he needed to extinguish to feel powerful again. Chanhwa didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds or reach for a weapon that wasn't there. The cold, logical predator who had ruled the Neri syndicate for a decade vanished in a flash of emerald silk. As the second shot rang out, a dull, heavy thud that signaled the end of a life, Chanhwa threw herself into the line of fire. She crashed into Hazel, her body a shield of soft fabric and hard-earned scars, absorbing the impact that was meant for the woman she loved. The impact felt like a hot iron being driven into her shoulder, a blooming, white-hot agony that stole the air from her lungs. They went down together, the midnight velvet of Hazel's gown tangling with the emerald of Chanhwa's suit as they hit the polished marble floor. "Chanhwa!" Hazel's voice was a raw, primal cry that echoed off the high ceilings. She caught the falling woman in her arms, her dark hands immediately pressing against the spreading crimson stain on the green silk. No, stay with me, look at me." The ballroom erupted into chaos, security teams swarming the entrance, the high society elites screaming and scattering like frightened birds. But for Chanhwa, the world had narrowed to the steady, terrified gaze of the woman holding her. The iron-cold armor she had worn since she was 12 years old had finally, irrevocably cracked. "I told you," Chanhwa whispered, her voice bubbling with a faint metallic rasp as she looked up at Hazel. Her hand, trembling and slick with her own blood, reached up to touch Hazel's cheek. "You're an idiot," Hazel choked out, tears finally breaking through her regal composure and falling on Chanhwa's forehead like a benediction. "I was supposed to protect you." "You did," Chanhwa murmured, her eyes fluttering as the pain began to fade into a heavy, peaceful gray.
As the Sovereign's elite tactical team tackled Jinho in the distance, Hazel didn't look away from the woman in her arms. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against Chunhua's, her pulse hammering against the dying rhythm of the other woman's heart. In the middle of her own empire, surrounded by the wreckage of a gala, Hazel realized that all the billions in the world meant nothing if the Iron Lily didn't bloom again.
The bandages beneath Chunhua's tailored silk blazer were a hidden reminder of the price of her rebirth. But as she stood in the sun-drenched atrium of the Emerald Sovereign, the ache in her shoulder felt like a badge of honor rather than a wound. The Iron Lily had officially withered, and in its place, something far more resilient had taken root. She had signed away the last of the Neri Syndicate's assets, dismantling the dark legacy of her father with the same clinical precision she once used to expand it. She wasn't a guest anymore, and she certainly wasn't a prisoner. She was the Sovereign's new director of global security, a woman who knew exactly how the monsters moved because she had once been their queen. Hazel appeared at the top of the grand staircase, no longer hiding behind an apron or a ghost's anonymity. She moved with the quiet power of a woman who had finally claimed her throne, her dark eyes finding Chunhua's across the bustling lobby. The staff, who now knew the truth of their invisible employer, bowed with a genuine respect that had nothing to do with fear. "The merger with the logistics firm is finalized," Hazel said as she reached the floor, her voice a warm, grounding melody that made the marble walls feel like a home. She didn't stop until she was standing in Chunhua's space, her hand finding the small of the other woman's back. Legitimately this time. No threats, no blood, just business. Chunhua let out a soft, rare laugh, the sound bright and clear. "It's surprisingly quiet when you aren't waiting for a knife in the dark." "That's because you're the one holding the door now," Hazel whispered, her gaze softening with an affection that still made Chunhua's breath hitch. They walked together toward the massive glass doors, the maid and the boss stepping out into the crisp soul air as partners in a new, untainted dynasty. The city still hummed with its usual greed and shadows, but the Emerald Sovereign stood as a fortress of a different kind, a place where service was a choice and power was a shield. As they looked over the skyline they were rebuilding together, Chunhua realized that Hazel hadn't just saved her life in that ballroom, she had given her a reason to have one. The dragon had finally left the cave, not to burn the world, but to build a garden where the lilies could grow without thorns. Moral of the story: never mistake a person's service for their status, nor their silence for a lack of power, for the heart you choose to insult today may be the only one holding the keys to your survival tomorrow. True royalty is not found in the crown you wear, but in how you treat those you believe have none.